My fiancée wanted to send my kids to boarding school so her alcoholic brother could live in our house. I ended it. But when her brother stole everything and she ended up homeless, she came back begging. What I did left them speechless. I'm 38 years old, work in logistics for a transportation company, and honestly, never thought I'd be here telling this story. But I need to get it all out because what happened a few months ago still has me processing a lot of things. I'm a single father of two incredible kids, Mason, who's 12, and Isabella, who's 10. And basically my entire life revolves around them since my wife passed away 4 years ago. I'm not going to go into much detail about that because it's painful and it's not really what this story is about, but you need to know that context to understand why what happened next was so freaking devastating. After my wife died, I spent like 2 years basically on autopilot. You know, wake up, take the kids to school, go to work, pick them up, make dinner, help them with homework, put them to bed, and repeat. Weekends were for them, always. We'd go to the park, watch movies. I tried to maintain some normalcy in their lives because they had lost their mom and I was determined that they wouldn't feel like they'd lost their dad too. My friends told me I needed to get out more, that I needed to meet people. But the truth is I wasn't ready, and I also wasn't sure if I ever would be. The house where we live, it's the same house where my kids grew up, where they have all their memories with their mom, and for me that was always sacred. You know what I mean? It wasn't just a house, it was their home, their safe space. About 2.5 years ago, give or take, I started going out a bit more. Nothing serious, just barbecues with friends, some beers on Fridays when the kids were with my in-laws. It was at one of those barbecues where I met Jessica. She was 34, worked in marketing for a tech company, and honestly, I thought she was amazing from the start. She was funny, smart, had this energy that made everyone in the room feel comfortable, and when we talked that first night, we connected in a way I hadn't felt in years. She asked about my kids almost immediately, which I appreciated because a lot of people, when they meet a single dad, kind of back off. But she seemed genuinely interested. She told me she'd always wanted a family, that she loved kids, and I thought, wow, maybe this could work. We started dating casually at first, coffees here and there, the occasional dinner when the kids were with my in-laws, and after like 3 months I introduced her to Mason and Isabella. I was nervous as hell, because for me introducing them to someone was a huge step. I told them we were going to meet a friend of mine, and we went out for pizza, something relaxed. Jessica was great that first time. She asked them about school, about their favorite things, bought them ice cream afterwards, and the kids seemed comfortable with her. Mason, who's always been the more observant and cautious of the two, told me afterwards that he thought she was all right, that she was nice, and that for me was like a blessing because Mason doesn't give his approval easily. The next few months were, I guess the word is idyllic. Jessica started coming over to the house more. We'd cook together, watch movies with the kids. She even helped Isabella with her science project and Mason with his English essays. She seemed to fit perfectly into our lives, like she'd been there all along. My in-laws met her and they liked her too, which was important to me because they're very protective of the kids, obviously, and their approval meant a lot. Everything seemed to be going in the right direction, and for the first time in years I felt like, maybe, just maybe, we could be a complete family again. After a year of being together, I decided I wanted to propose to her. I planned this whole thing at the park, where we'd taken the kids a bunch of times. I told Mason and Isabella beforehand because I wanted them to be involved, and they were excited. We bought a ring together. Well, I bought it, but they helped me pick it out. And one Saturday afternoon, we all went to the park. I set up a picnic, and when the moment came, I got down on one knee and asked her if she'd marry me. She cried, the kids clapped, and she said yes. It was perfect, literally one of the best days of my life after years of pain and loss. I thought we'd finally found our second chance. But then, and there's always a but right, things started to change. Not immediately, it was gradual, like those changes you don't notice until they're already there completely. A few weeks after getting engaged, Jessica started making comments about the house, small things at first. Like, oh, we should redecorate the living room, or maybe we could change the dining room furniture. I didn't think much of it because I thought it was normal. That she wanted to put her touch on the place, and I was willing to make some reasonable changes. But then the comments became more specific and more frequent. She'd say things like, "There are too many kid things all over the house, we need more adult space," or she'd look at the pictures of my wife that we still had on some walls and suggest that maybe it was time to put them away. That made me uncomfortable. I explained to her that those pictures were important for the kids, that they needed to have memories of their mom visible. And she said she understood, but that we also needed to create our own memories. She said it in a way that sounded reasonable, but something in my stomach felt weird. You know, that feeling that something's not right, but you can't identify exactly what it is. She started mentioning that we needed our own guest space, that Isabella's room was too big for a girl her age, things like that. I mostly ignored them or changed the subject because I didn't want to fight, but the seeds of doubt were already planted. It was around that time that Jessica started talking more about her brother Kevin. I knew she had a brother. She'd mentioned they didn't get along super well and that he'd had some problems, but she never went into details. Now suddenly it was like her favorite topic. Kevin this, Kevin that, Kevin's going through a rough time, Kevin needs help. She told me he was like 32 years old, that he'd lost his job a year ago, that he was struggling with alcohol, that he was basically living couch to couch with friends because he couldn't maintain a place of his own. I felt sympathy, honestly, because we all go through tough times, and I asked her what kind of help he needed, thinking maybe we could help him find work or connect him with some rehab program. But no, what Jessica had in mind was different. One day, we were making dinner, and the kids were in their rooms doing homework, and she casually, like it was no big deal, mentions that she'd been thinking about boarding school options for Mason and Isabella. I froze with the knife in my hand, cutting vegetables. I asked her why would she be thinking about that, and she said it was just an idea, that she'd heard boarding schools were excellent for children's development, that they taught independence and responsibility. I told her no, that my kids weren't going to any boarding school, that they were happy here, in their home, in their school, with their friends, and that there was no reason to change that. She got a bit defensive and said she was just suggesting it, that it wasn't a demand, but I could see in her eyes that there was something more. I asked her directly, "Does this have something to do with your brother?" And she turned red, like literally her cheeks colored, and she admitted that, well, maybe she'd thought that if the kids were at boarding school during the week, we'd have more space in the house, and Kevin could stay with us for a while until he got back on his feet. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. I told her she was crazy if she thought I was going to send my kids away from their home, so her adult brother, who apparently couldn't keep his life together, could move in with us. She insisted it would only, be temporary. That Kevin just needed a stable place for a few months to be able to look for work and get on his feet, and that the kids would be better off in a structured environment like a boarding school. I exploded. I told her my kids weren't going anywhere, that this was their home, that they had lost their mother and they weren't going to lose their home too, and that if Kevin needed help, there were other ways to help him that didn't involve displacing my children. She got angry and accused me of not being understanding of her family, of not wanting to make sacrifices for our relationship, and I told her there was a big difference between making sacrifices and risking my children's well-being. We had a huge fight that night. She left to her apartment, and we didn't talk for like 3 days. I spent those 3 days thinking about everything, about all the little signs I'd ignored, about all the comments about the house and the kids, and I realized that maybe I didn't know Jessica as well as I thought. When we finally talked, she apologized, said she'd been insensitive, that she understood my kids were my priority, and I thought we'd gotten past it. But oh man, was I so wrong. Things were tense for a couple of weeks, but seemingly normal. Until one Saturday afternoon, I was in the garage fixing Mason's bike, and I hear the doorbell. I go to answer, and there's this guy, like 32 years old, but he looked older, with a backpack and a face that screamed trouble. He tells me, "Hey, I'm Kevin, Jessica's brother," and before I could say anything, he was already trying to come into the house, saying that Jessica had told him he could stay with us for a while. I stopped him at the door and told him no, that there was some misunderstanding, that Jessica and I hadn't agreed to that. He immediately got defensive and aggressive, saying his sister had promised he could stay, that he needed a place, that I was his future brother-in-law and should help him. I called Jessica, immediately, and she arrived like 20 minutes later. We had another massive fight, this time with Kevin there, listening to everything from the porch because I didn't let him in. She admitted she'd told Kevin he could stay, that she'd assumed I would change my mind, that she was sure once I met Kevin I'd see he wasn't so bad. I was furious, like shaking with rage, and I told her how dare she do something like that without consulting me, that this was my house, my kid's house, and that she had no right to invite someone to live there without my consent. Kevin started getting into the conversation, telling me I was selfish, that I had this whole big house and couldn't give a room to someone who needed it, and that was the last straw. I told him to get off my property right now or I'd call the police. He looked at me like he was going to hit me, but Jessica grabbed his arm and told him to leave, that she'd call him later. When Kevin left, I turned to Jessica and asked her directly, "What's your plan here? Do you really want me to send my kids to boarding school so your brother can take their space?" And she, looking me straight in the eyes, said yes, that was exactly her expectation. That if I really loved her and wanted this marriage to work, I needed to make this sacrifice for her family. That Kevin was her brother. That it was her responsibility to take care of him, and that as her future husband, I should support her in that. That the kids would be fine at boarding school, that it would be good for them, and that we could visit them on weekends. That it was just temporary until Kevin got a job and could move out. I asked her how long was temporary, and she said she didn't know. Maybe a year, maybe more. It depended on how long it took Kevin to stabilize. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This woman, who had met my kids, who had seen what they'd been through, losing their mother, who had been in our home and had been part of our family, was seriously asking me to send them away to accommodate her irresponsible brother. I told her no, that was never going to happen, that she clearly didn't understand what it meant to be a parent or what my kids had been through. She told me I didn't understand what it meant to be part of a couple, that marriage was about compromise, and that if I wasn't willing to do this, then maybe we shouldn't get married. And that's when I realized that all this time, all those months when I thought we were building something together, she'd had her own agenda. That maybe she'd never really been interested in my kids or in being part of our family, but in what we could offer her and her brother. I sat down on the living room couch, that same couch where we'd watched movies with the kids, where Isabella would curl up when she had nightmares, and I told Jessica to leave. She asked if I was breaking up with her, and I said yes, that I couldn't be with someone who asked me to choose between her and my kids, because it wasn't even a choice. My kids were always going to come first. She got hysterical, started crying and screaming, saying I was throwing our relationship away over something I hadn't even tried, that I was being irrational, that I was going to regret it. I just told her she needed to leave now. She eventually left, but before leaving she told me she was going to get back all the money she'd put in for wedding deposits, that she'd spent thousands of dollars, and that if I wasn't going to follow through with the commitment, then I had to reimburse her. The next few days were chaos. Jessica wouldn't stop calling and texting me, alternating between begging me to reconsider and threatening me with lawsuits over the wedding money. I told her, let's review who paid for what, and I'd return her part, but that I needed time to gather the money. She didn't want to wait, said she needed it now, and when I asked her why such urgency, she admitted Kevin needed money to pay some debts. Then the really ugly stuff started. Jessica started telling our mutual friends that I'd been abusive to her, that I'd manipulated and controlled her throughout the relationship, that I'd been horrible to her when she met my family. People who I thought knew me started seeing me differently. Some even stopped talking to me. It was devastating because not only had I lost my fiancée, but now I was losing friends over lies she was spreading. Kevin also started messaging me, super aggressive texts saying I'd ruined his sister's life, that I was a selfish son of a bitch, that he was going to make me pay. I saved all those messages in case I needed a restraining order, but I hoped eventually he'd get tired and leave me alone. One night I got like 20 texts in a row from him, completely drunk from what I could tell, saying he knew where I lived, that he was going to come and make me regret it. Basically threats I took very seriously. I called the police and showed them the messages. They made a report but said, unless he actually came to my house, there wasn't much they could do. I changed the locks on the house because Jessica had a copy of the key, and I no longer trusted that she hadn't given it to Kevin. I explained to the kids that Jessica and I had broken up, that sometimes relationships don't work out even when we want them to, And although they were sad, especially Isabella who had gotten attached to her, they also seemed to understand. Mason, always the perceptive one, told me he'd noticed Jessica had been acting weird the last few weeks, that he'd heard some of our arguments even though we tried to keep them private, and that it was okay, that they only needed me. About 2 weeks passed of this hell, of messages from Jessica, alternating between begging and threatening, of texts from Kevin ranging from aggressive to manipulative, trying to make me feel guilty, and me trying to maintain some normalcy for my kids while dealing with all this. I collected the money to return Jessica's part of the wedding deposits. It was like $3,000 that hurt to pull out, but I was willing to pay it just to end all this and have her leave me alone. But then, and this is when things get almost comical if they weren't so messed up, I get a call from Jessica at 11 at night on a Tuesday. She was crying hysterically. I could barely understand her, and when she finally calmed down enough to talk, she told me Kevin had stolen her banking information and emptied her account. Something like $8,000, including the money she'd been saving, and the money I'd given her. Apparently, Kevin had access to her computer and had managed to transfer all the money to his account and then withdrawn it in cash. When she confronted him, he told her she owed it to him for all the years his family hadn't supported him, threw his stuff in a backpack, and disappeared. Jessica was completely devastated. Not just about the money, but because her own brother, the brother for whom she'd asked me to sacrifice my children, had betrayed her in the most horrible way possible. She asked me for help, said she had no one else, that she'd burned all her bridges defending Kevin, and now she realized she'd been a fool. I felt some pity for her, I'm not going to lie, but I also felt a sense of vindication, like this is exactly what I tried to warn you about. This is the brother for whom you wanted me to displace my kids. I told her I was sorry for her, that it was horrible, but that I couldn't help her anymore, that she'd made her choice when she gave me an ultimatum between her and my kids, and that I'd made mine. She started begging, saying she understood now, that she'd been blind, that Kevin was a manipulator, and she'd let herself be manipulated, that if she could turn back time, she'd do everything differently. I told her I appreciated her realizing that, but that the damage was already done, that I couldn't trust her again, and that I needed to move forward with my life and my kids' lives. I hung up the phone, and that was the last time we talked for like 2 weeks. But then, literally like a month ago, she showed up at my door on a Sunday afternoon. The kids were at my in-laws' house, fortunately. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept in days, and she told me she'd been sleeping in her car because she couldn't pay rent after Kevin stole everything, that she'd lost her job because she couldn't concentrate after all the drama, and that she desperately needed help. Part of me wanted to let her in, offer her a couch for a few nights, because I'm human and seeing someone in that situation is difficult. But then I remembered everything. I remembered how she'd been willing to send my kids away, how she'd lied about me to our friends, how she'd chosen her disaster of a brother over and over again over my family. And I realized that helping her would be betraying my kids. It would be telling them that people can treat us like garbage and still deserve our help. I gave her the number of some shelters in the area and the contact for social services that could help her find resources. I told her I hoped she could rebuild her life, but that I couldn't be part of that I needed to protect my kids and our home. She looked at me with this mixture of sadness and acceptance, nodded, and left. I closed the door and stood there for a few minutes, just processing everything. Now, a month later, things are returning to normal. The kids are fine. They're still in their school, in their house, surrounded by their things and their memories. Mason had a basketball game last week where he made the winning shot, and afterwards, he hugged me like it was the most important thing in the world. Isabella is in piano lessons, and she's learning this complicated Mozart piece that she practices every night. And even though it sounds terrible, it's still the most beautiful music I've heard, because it means she's here, in her house, doing 10-year-old girl things. Some people have asked me if I regret how I handled everything, if maybe I could have been more understanding, or tried to reach a compromise. And the answer is no. I'm never going to regret choosing my kids. I'm never going to regret protecting their home and their stability. Does it hurt to have lost what I thought I had with Jessica? Sure. Do I feel bad about how things ended up for her? A little. But at the end of the day, my kids didn't ask for any of this situation. They already lost enough, and it was my job to make sure they didn't lose anything more. Last week, Isabella asked me if I'd ever have a girlfriend again. I told her I didn't know. That maybe someday, but that if I did, it would be with someone who understood her and me as a unit, someone who wouldn't try to change what we are or how we live. She nodded and said, "That's okay, Dad. We don't need anyone else anyway. We're fine like this." And she's right. We're fine like this. The three of us, together in our house, with our memories and our routine and our space. And that's enough. More than enough.